On his 35th birthday, my son raised a glass of expensive champagne and threatened to cut me out of his life unless I started paying him for the privilege of being his mother. He called me a burden while standing in a house owned by a trust he didn't know I controlled. He thought he was severing a leech, but he was actually holding a knife to his own financial throat. My name is Eleanor Hart, and at 61 years old, I have learned that the sharpest knives are not found in the kitchen, but in the mouths of those you raised. I moved silently through the crowded living room of the 3,000-square-foot house in the wealthy suburbs of Denver, collecting half-empty champagne flutes. I wore my navy dress, the one I had bought at a discount store 7 years ago, clean but undeniably dated. To the 20 or so guests gathered here, I was invisible. A grey-haired fixture indistinguishable from the hired catering staff, except that I was not being paid. It was Brandon's 35th birthday. My son stood by the floor-to-ceiling fireplace, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, looking every inch the successful wealth manager he claimed to be. He was boasting to a circle of men about his new Tesla and the ski trip to Aspen he had booked for next month. "It is all about the hustle," Brandon said, his voice carrying over the low hum of jazz music. "You have to eat what you kill in this market. Nobody handed me anything. I built this life brick by brick." I gripped the tray of dirty glasses tighter. I remembered the check I had written for the down payment on this very house, structured through a limited liability company so he would never feel emasculated by his mother's money. I remembered the tuition payments, the car insurance, the seed capital for his firm. A man in a sharp grey suit turned and noticed me hovering near the kitchen island. He smiled politely. "Eleanor, you must be incredibly proud," the man said, raising his glass toward me. "It is a blessing to have a son who can provide for you like this in your golden years. Isn't it?" The room went quiet. Brandon's smile did not reach his eyes. He stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. It felt less like an embrace and more like a restraint. "I take care of everything," Brandon said, his voice smooth but laced with a sudden, icy edge. "Concessions have to be made. Of course. I am happy to support my mother, as long as she cooperates." I looked up at him. The alcohol had loosened his inhibitions, or perhaps he had planned this public execution all along. "Actually, I am glad everyone is here to witness this," Brandon announced, turning to face the room. "Mom, we need to set some ground rules. If you want to keep living in the room upstairs, things are going to change. Starting next month, I expect a contribution. Let us call it fair share rent, $2,000 a month." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but nobody spoke. 2,000, I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It is a fair market rate," Brandon snapped. "If you cannot pay, then you are out. I am cutting the supplementary credit card. I am done carrying dead weight. If you cannot contribute to this household, then we are done. No more free rides. No more mother and son charity cases." Madison, his wife, glided to his side, linking her arm through his. She looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap. "Oh, Eleanor, do not look so shocked," Madison said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It is just economics. The older generation has to stop being such a burden on the new one. Maybe you could sell that old car of yours, or dip into whatever retirement fund you have left. We are just trying to teach you some responsibility." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the room. Heads nodded. They saw a successful young couple setting boundaries with a leeching parent. They saw exactly what Brandon wanted them to see. I stood there, the tray trembling slightly in my hands, not from fear, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the irony. Brandon raised his glass high. "Here is to cutting the cord," he declared. "Either you pay up by the first of the month, or you get out. To tough love. To tough love." The guests echoed, clinking their glasses. I set the tray down on the marble countertop. The clatter of glass against stone cut through the applause. I straightened my back, smoothing the wrinkles of my old navy dress. I looked at Madison, then at Brandon. I locked eyes with my son. "If you want to speak to me like a landlord, that is fine," I said, my voice low but perfectly steady. "But are you absolutely certain you know who is actually paying the bills in this house?" Brandon frowned, the glass halting halfway to his lips. A few guests paused, sensing a shift in the air, but my son just laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that sealed his fate. I did not learn silence in that living room. I learned it decades ago, at a scratched kitchen table in a small, rusting town in Ohio, where the only thing that moved fast was the wind. My mother was a cashier who stood on her feet for 10 hours a day, and my father drove a truck across state lines, chasing miles for pennies. My childhood was not defined by toys or vacations, but by the stack of envelopes on that table. I learned to read by deciphering the bright red stamps that said "Final Notice" and "Overdue." I promised myself then, watching my mother count quarters to buy milk, that I would never be at the mercy of a piece of paper. By the time I was 20 years old, I was surviving on 4 hours of sleep and stale diner coffee. I attended community college during the day, studying accounting until the numbers danced behind my eyelids, and worked the graveyard shift at a roadside diner. The customers there, men with grease under their fingernails and exhaustion in their bones, looked at me and saw just another waitress. "Honey, just bring the check," they would say, dismissing the textbooks I kept open by the register. They did not know I had the highest scores in the district. They did not know I was building a mind that could dismantle a balance sheet faster than they could strip an engine. Then came Thomas Hart. My husband was a man of big dreams and expensive suits, a financial broker who believed success was something you could fake until it became real. I was the engine room to his shiny exterior. I worked as an accountant, slowly climbing the ladder, eventually managing the books for several small funds. But Thomas had a weakness for risk that he could not control. When I discovered he had hidden $40,000 in gambling debts and falsified client reports to cover it, I did not scream. I fixed it. I took the professional hit for oversight errors, nearly losing my license to save his reputation. That was the moment the girl from Ohio died, and the woman who understood the true weight of responsibility was born. I realized that safety did not come from a salary. It came from ownership. I reached out to 3 old colleagues, men and women who had been pushed out by younger, louder executives. Together, we formed Marigold Ember Trustworks. To the outside world, it was a boring, faceless entity. But inside, we were sharks who swam in deep, quiet waters. We bought distressed assets after the market crashes. We bought commercial real estate when everyone else was selling. For 25 years, I compounded every dollar. I bought office buildings and leased them back to the very startups that laughed at people like me. I created layers of shell companies, not to hide illegalities, but to buy myself the luxury of anonymity. When Thomas died of a stroke, I did not change. I stayed in my modest apartment. I drove my 10-year-old sedan. I poured the millions I made into irrevocable trusts for Brandon and his future children, locking the principal away so it could grow. Brandon grew up surrounded by comfort, but he never asked where it came from. He assumed it was his father's legacy. He saw my frugality not as discipline, but as a defect. I remember the day he stopped respecting me. It was 5 years ago. He had just started his firm and was ashamed that I arrived at his launch party wearing a coat I had owned for a decade. Mom, honestly. Brandon had hissed, pulling me into a corner. You are embarrassing me. Why can you not just look the part? People think you are destitute. He did not see the irony. He did not know that the very building we were standing in, the glass and steel fortress where he leased his headquarters, had gone up for sale 3 months prior. He did not know that Marigold Ember Trustworks had purchased it for $12 million in cash. I had looked at him then, really looked at him, and decided not to tell him. I simply nodded and let him believe he was the prince of the city. I signed the deed through 3 layers of LLCs, becoming his landlord without him ever knowing that the rent checks he signed every month were ultimately deposited into the very account he would later threaten to cut me off from. You are right, Brandon. I had said that night. I am just out of touch. I was not out of touch. I was simply holding the deed. The house finally settled into a silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. Downstairs, the crystal glasses were likely sticky with the dregs of expensive champagne, and the air probably still smelled of my son's arrogance. But up here, in the small attic room that Madison referred to as the guest suite, but treated like a storage unit, the air was cold. I sat at my small wooden desk, the single yellow lamp casting long, tired shadows against the wall. My hands, which had been trembling with rage downstairs, were now perfectly steady. It was time to work. I knelt by the closet and pulled out the old fireproof box hidden beneath a stack of winter blankets. It was heavy, scratched, and ugly, much like the history I carried. I spun the dial, the mechanical clicks sounding like gunshots in the quiet room. Inside lay the paper trail of my life and the secret map of Brandon's. I laid the documents out on the bedspread. First, the deed to this very house at 4500 Maple Drive. Brandon believed he owned it because his name was on the mailbox. But the title belonged to a limited liability company wholly owned by Marigold Ember Trustworks. Next to it, I placed the commercial property deed for the glass building in downtown Denver, where Brandon played the role of a master of the universe. He was a tenant, I was the landlord. Then came the thickest file, the Hart Family Trust. Brandon thought of this trust as his personal piggy bank, a bottomless well left by his father. He had never bothered to read the fine print on page 42. The clause was standard, but lethal. It designated me, Eleanor Hart, as the trust protector with absolute authority to freeze, alter, or suspend all distributions if the beneficiary engaged in conduct detrimental to the family reputation. I turned to my ancient laptop, the fan whirring noisily as it woke up. I did not open a banking app. Instead, I opened a secure email chain with an investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I had started this correspondence 3 months ago, under a pseudonym. I stared at the attachments I had already sent spreadsheets showing how Brandon was moving capital from new investors to pay out returns to older ones. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, dressed up in a suit. I clicked on an audio file I had extracted from his cloud backup weeks ago. I needed to hear it one last time to steel myself. The voice that filled the room was my son's. but the tone was a stranger's. "Listen to me. Gladys." Brandon's voice sneered from the speakers. "I am done explaining this to you. Either you move the rest of your pension to this fund, or you are going to be poor forever. Do not come crying to me when you are eating cat food because you were too stupid to listen." I paused the recording. My chest tightened. He was not just a spoiled child. He was a predator. He was hunting the very people I used to be. The question in my mind shifted. It was no longer about whether I could ruin him. It was about how much destruction was necessary to save his soul, or at least stop him from destroying others. I took a notepad and a pen. I wrote down 3 items. 1, suspend all monthly trust distributions effective immediately. 2, issue a notice of lease termination for the downtown office. 3, close the supplementary platinum credit card he carried in his wallet. The one he thought was his, but was actually a secondary line on my account, which I had kept active since he was 18. I looked at the list. A bitter smile touched my lips. Downstairs. He had threatened to cut me off if I did not pay him $2,000 a month. He had no idea that for the last 5 years, every steak dinner he ate, every flight he booked, and every suit he wore was paid for by a system I had designed. I picked up my phone. It was past 2 in the morning, but I knew he would be awake. I dialed the number of Lionel Brooks. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly with sleep but alert. Eleanor Lionel asked, "Is everything all right?" I looked at the documents spread out on the bed, the weapons of a war I had hoped never to fight. "No, Lionel, nothing is all right." I said softly, "I need you to clear your schedule for tomorrow morning. It is time we talk like actual shareholders." Lionel Brooks operated out of a brownstone in downtown Denver that smelled of mahogany and old dust, a sharp contrast to the sterile, glass-walled aquarium my son rented. Lionel was the only other person on Earth who knew the full architecture of Marigold Ember Trustworks. He was a man who wore 3-piece suits, not for fashion, but out of habit, and his silence was worth more than his hourly rate. I sat in the leather chair opposite him, my hands folded in my lap. I recounted the events of the previous night with the clinical detachment of a forensic accountant. I did not mention the sting of Madison's insults or the laughter of the guests. I focused on the terms, the demand for $2,000 a month, the threat of eviction, the ultimatum. Lionel listened without blinking. When I finished, he leaned back, tenting his fingers. "He actually threatened to cut your credit card?" Lionel asked, his deep voice rumbling with disbelief. The one you pay the balance on, he believes it is his account," I said. "He believes a lot of things." Lionel reached for the stack of documents I had placed on his desk. He flipped through the operating agreement for the LLC that owned Brandon's office building. He traced a finger down the trust indenture for the Hart Family Trust. "You have more power here than you realize." "Eleanor," Lionel said, tapping the paper. "Legally speaking, you are not his dependent. You are his employer. You are his landlord. You are his banker." We moved to the whiteboard. Together. We drew a timeline that looked less like a family history and more like a criminal indictment. We marked the date Brandon started his firm with capital he thought came from an angel investor in New York, which was actually a shell company I managed. We marked the dates he began selling high-yield notes to retirees. Every major milestone in his life was pinned to a check I had silently written or a crisis I had quietly averted. "We have 3 options," Lionel said, capping the marker. "Option A is the soft kill. We quietly cut the funding, let his business starve, and watch him panic. Option B is the nuclear option. We hand everything to the authorities immediately. Option C. We use your leverage to force him into the light. I looked at the photograph of my 2 grandchildren, Emily and Josh, that I kept in my wallet. The children are off limits, I said firmly. Whatever we do, the educational trusts for Emily and Josh must be firewalled. I want to punish my son, not destroy their future. Understood, Lionel said. We will transfer the beneficiary rights for the long-term holdings directly to them, with an independent guardian appointed. Brandon will not be able to touch a cent of the principal. Then came the paperwork. It was a symphony of bureaucracy. First, we drafted a formal letter from Marigold Ember Property Management. It was a notice of non-renewal for the commercial lease of Brandon's office suite. We cited a renovation clause. The terms were non-negotiable. He had 60 days to vacate the premises. He is going to call the number on the letterhead screaming, Lionel warned. Let him scream? I said. The answering service is automated. Next. Lionel prepared the suspension order for the Hart Family Trust, with a single signature. I froze the monthly distribution that subsidized his mortgage and his Tesla payments. Effective the 1st of next month, his income would drop by 40%. Finally, the hardest part. I handed Lionel the flash drive containing the accounting irregularities I had found. Lionel dialed a number he knew by heart. It was a direct line to a senior investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission. "This is Lionel Brooks," he said into the receiver. "I am sitting with the whistleblower you have been hoping to find regarding Hart and Partners." "Yes. We have the ledgers." Lionel listened for a moment, then covered the mouthpiece. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. "Eleanor, once we do this, there is no going back," Lionel said softly. "Do you want to get revenge, or do you want to save him?" I stood up and smoothed my skirt. I thought of the old man Brandon had threatened on the phone. I thought of the smirk on my son's face when he told me to pay up to be his mother. I want him to feel the exact value of what he is spending, I said, my voice steady. If he can save himself after that, well, that is up to him. The ignorance in the house was almost palpable, a thick fog that only I could see through. On Tuesday morning, Brandon was standing in the kitchen, loudly booking a suite at the Bellagio for a boys' trip to Las Vegas. He was talking about bottle service and table minimums, boasting into his phone about closing a deal that did not exist. He had no idea that 3 miles away, in the gleaming glass tower he treated as his personal kingdom, a digital bomb was about to detonate. At 10 o'clock sharp, the email from Marigold Ember Property Management landed in his inbox. I was not there to see his face, but I knew exactly what it said. It was a standard, icy notification of lease termination. Section 4, paragraph B. The owners were exercising their right to reclaim the space for renovation. He had 60 days to vacate. By dinner time, the storm had made landfall at home. Brandon slammed the front door so hard the foyer mirror rattled. He threw a printed copy of the email onto the dining table, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and fear. Greedy. Absolute parasites. Brandon spat, pacing around the room while Madison poured him a large glass of wine. "They are kicking us out. 60 days' notice." I called the number, and some drone just told me it was an ownership decision. No negotiation, no discussion. Just get out. "Can they do that?" a friend of his asked, picking up the letter. This is prime real estate. In this country, nobody cares about the honest businessman anymore. Brandon ranted, stabbing his fork into his steak. I built that office. I put my brand on that lobby. And they just erase me because they want to renovate Madison. Ever the pragmatist in the worst possible way, narrowed her eyes. She looked at the letter. Then she looked at the ceiling, towards my room. Well, if we are losing the office space, we need to tighten the belt immediately, Madison said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that I could hear perfectly from the hallway. If this house is going to become your headquarters temporarily, we do not have room for non-performing assets. If the company is being squeezed, we cannot carry a liability that does not generate income. She meant me. Brandon finished his wine in one gulp and nodded. He marched to the bottom of the stairs and yelled my name. Eleanor downstairs. Now. I walked down slowly, holding the railing. I found them standing in the living room, a united front of entitlement. Brandon did not offer me a seat. He stood with his arms crossed, adopting the posture of a CEO addressing a delinquent employee. Mum? Plans have changed? Brandon said, his voice cold. The business is facing some unexpected overhead. We are restructuring, starting next month. The contribution we talked about. It is not optional anymore. You pay the full market rate for a room in this zip code. That is $3,000 a month. Airbnb prices. I looked at him. And if I do not have $3,000, then you find somewhere else to live, Brandon said, shrugging. And do not think you are coming back to visit the kids whenever you want. If you are not part of this household's economy, you are not part of the family schedule. No money, no access. I am done subsidizing you. You would use your own children as leverage? I asked quietly. You dare to hold yourself hostage for money? Brandon laughed, a sharp, barking sound. Mum, you just do not understand the real world. You think love pays the mortgage. You think being a grandmother earns you points. Wake up. In the real world, if you cannot pay, you get cut. Simple as that. I looked at Madison. She smirked and took a sip of her wine. I looked back at my son. I understand perfectly, I said. I did not scream. I did not beg. I turned around and walked back up the stairs, my steps heavy but steady. I went into my room and closed the door. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed in the darkness. I navigated to the secure portal for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I attached 3 new files, the internal ledgers showing the commingling of funds, the client list targeting vulnerable seniors, and the recording of him threatening the old woman. Do you want to talk about being cut? I whispered to the empty room. Fine. I pressed send. It was done. The blade had dropped. Downstairs. I could hear Brandon's voice rising again, manic and delusional, telling Madison that this was actually a good thing, that he would find an even better office, something worthy of the brand. I reached into my purse and pulled out the Greyhound bus ticket I had bought earlier that day. It was for a 6 o'clock departure tomorrow morning to downtown Denver. I would be at the courthouse before he even woke up. He thought he was evicting me. He had no idea I was about to foreclose on his entire life. The fluorescent lights of the Securities and Exchange Commission regional office hummed with a sound that reminded me of a hospital waiting room. I sat across from 2 young investigators, Agent Miller and Agent Park. Between us lay a graveyard of my son's integrity, stacks of spreadsheets, glossy brochures, and client statements. He calls it the evergreen yield strategy, I said, pointing to a column of numbers highlighted in yellow. But if you look here, the returns are consistently 3 to 4% above the S&P 500, regardless of market volatility. In 20 years of accounting, I have never seen a line this straight. It is unnatural. Agent Miller leaned in, his eyes scanning the data. He is posting gains in months where the sector was down 10%. Exactly, I replied. He is not hedging. He is cannibalizing. The capital from the new investors in Q3 was immediately transferred to the operating account to pay the quarterly distributions for the Q1 clients. It is a classic Ponzi structure, dressed up in a suit and tie. The door opened, and a frail man walked in, leaning heavily on a cane. This was Mr. Henderson, a retired mechanic I had convinced to come forward. He sat down, his hands shaking as he clasped them over the handle of his cane. Mr. Henderson, Agent Park said gently, can you tell us what Mr. Hart told you when you hesitated to invest? Mr. Henderson took a shallow breath. He told me. He said that the economy was collapsing. He said if I did not move my pension to his fund immediately, I would be left behind. He said, do you want to be a burden on your children? Arthur. That scared me. I wrote the check the next day. I closed my eyes. It was the same weapon he had used on me. Fear. Shame. The threat of being a burden. The investigation moved with terrifying speed after that. The agents discovered that Brandon had hired a marketing firm specifically to target 55-plus active living communities. They found invoices for retirement wealth seminars hosted in the very conference rooms of the building owned by Marigold Ember Trustworks. He had been using my property to hunt his prey. While the government built its case, I quietly drove to my granddaughter's private school. I met with the headmistress in her office, the smell of chalk and old books filling the air. Mrs. Hart, is everything all right? She asked. There may be some financial turbulence in my son's household soon, I said, handing her a check drawn from a blind trust. This covers the full tuition for both Emily and Josh for the next 5 years. Please process it under the anonymous scholarship fund we discussed. My son must never know it came from me. The hammer fell on a Tuesday morning. I was not there, but I knew the schedule. At 9 o'clock, the employees of Hart and Partners arrived to find the glass doors locked. 2 black SUVs were parked at the curb, engine blocks ticking in the cool air. Men in windbreakers with SEC and Financial Crimes Division printed on the back were already inside, taping brown paper over the glass walls of the conference room. Brandon was escorted into the main meeting room. They did not handcuff him yet, but they did something worse. Agent Miller slid a search warrant across the mahogany table. It was signed by a federal judge. We have probable cause, Mr. Hart, Miller said. Brandon scanned the document, his eyes darting frantically. He stopped at the section detailing the evidence. It cited specific ledgers, hidden accounts, and audio recordings provided by a confidential informant. The name was redacted with a thick black line, but the level of access the informant had was impossible for an outsider. Who? Brandon stammered, his face draining of color. Who gave you this? These are on my private server. We cannot discuss ongoing sources, the agent replied. By noon, the news had broken. Local wealth manager raided in fraud probe flashed across the chyron of the local news station. In the house on Maple Drive, panic set in. Madison, who had spent years curating an image of effortless affluence, saw her digital kingdom crumbling. She did not call a lawyer. She grabbed her phone and began frantically deleting posts, pictures of the Aspen trip, the new handbags, the Tesla gone in seconds. She was scrubbing the evidence of her lifestyle, trying to distance her personal brand from the radioactive fallout of her husband's name. I sat in a small coffee shop 3 blocks away from the courthouse, watching the muted television mounted in the corner. I saw the footage of agents carrying boxes out of the building I owned. I saw a blurry shot of Brandon arguing with an agent. "That looks bad," the barista said, wiping down the counter as she glanced at the screen. "Another rich guy stealing from people." "Yes," I said, taking a sip of my black coffee. "It is a tragedy." I did not smile. There was no joy in watching my son's life dismantle itself. But as I watched the ticker tape scroll by, I felt a strange, cold sense of relief. The lie was over. The bill had finally come due. The house was a cage of tension. For 3 days. Brandon had been a ghost, pacing the hallways, making frantic, hushed phone calls behind closed doors. He was drowning, and in his desperation, he finally remembered the one person he had always assumed was a life raft. He didn't know I was the ocean. It was past midnight when he knocked on my bedroom door. He didn't wait for an answer before pushing it open. The arrogance from the birthday party was gone, replaced by a hollow, frantic look. His shirt was wrinkled, and he smelled of stale coffee and fear. "Mum, I need to talk to you," Brandon said, his voice cracking. "Please. It is bad." I sat up in bed, pulling my shawl around my shoulders. "What is it?" "Brandon." He came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, putting his head in his hands. "The SEC. They do not understand how the market works," he began, the lies tumbling out automatically. "They are twisting everything. It is just liquidity issues, standard stuff. But they froze my operating accounts. Mum, I need a bridge loan. Just until this blows over. I know you have some retirement savings. If you could just loan me 50,000 or sign a statement saying you reviewed the products and they were safe." I looked at him, at the desperation in his eyes that was only for himself. "You want $50,000? I asked quietly. "Will you use that money to pay back the elderly people you took from? Or is it for a retainer, for another lawyer to protect your reputation?" He flinched. He didn't answer. Instead, he shifted gears, his voice dropping to a manipulative whisper. "Mom, think about the kids," he said, leaning closer. "If I go down, if I go to prison, Emily and Josh become orphans, social orphans. Do you want that? Do you want to be the reason this family is destroyed? Because if you do not help me, that is what happens. You are breaking us." It was a low blow, perfectly aimed. I let my face soften, feigning the hesitation he expected. I do not want the children to suffer," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But I cannot just sign a blank check. Brandon, I need to understand. If I am going to help, you need to write it down. For my own peace of mind, write down exactly how the accounts were structured, so I can show my lawyer. If it makes sense, I will see what I can do." Hope flared in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought I was the same gullible mother he had bullied for years. "Okay," he said, nodding rapidly. "Okay, I can do that. It is complicated. Basically, we used the new capital to cover the yield spread. It is not stealing. It is timing. We just charged a management fee up front to cover the gap. The old people. They did not read the fee structure. That is on them. But I can write it out so it looks technical. He spent the next hour at my small desk, scribbling furiously on a legal pad, explaining the fee burying, the yield manipulation, the way he targeted clients with dementia. He talked through it all, his voice rising with the excitement of justifying his own brilliance. He didn't know that the small digital clock on my nightstand was recording every word. When he finished, he ripped the pages off the pad and handed them to me with a shaky smile. "Here," Brandon said. "Read it. You will see. It is just business. Now, about that check." I took the papers. I read his confession, written in his own hand. Then I picked up a pen. I didn't sign a check. I wrote a single line at the bottom of his statement, received. I do not consent to perjury. I handed the pad back to him. What is this?" he asked, staring at the words. "You just used me as a human shield again." "Brandon," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You wanted me to pay for your crimes. I am declining the transaction." He stood up, his face twisting in confusion and anger, but he was too exhausted to fight. He stormed out, slamming the door, convinced he could still manipulate me in the morning. As soon as his footsteps faded down the hall, I picked up the recording device and the carbon copy of the notes he had unknowingly made on the pad underneath. I put them in a manila envelope addressed to Lionel Brooks and the SEC. "There is no saving you now," I whispered to the closed door. "Only stopping you." The subpoena for the federal hearing arrived on a Thursday, heavy with the seal of the United States District Court. Brandon was facing 12 counts of securities fraud and wire fraud. His high-priced defense attorney was already floating the idea of a plea deal to reduce the sentence. But the government wanted a show trial. They wanted a face for the greed. My lawyer, Lionel, called me that afternoon. "The SEC is offering to list you as confidential witness A," Lionel said. "You do not have to appear in open court. Eleanor, we can submit your deposition in chambers. It would spare you the public spectacle." "No," I said, looking at the grey sky outside my window. "I want the hearing open, and I want to testify in person. I am done hiding in the shadows." "Lionel, if my son is going to look at his accuser, I want him to see his mother, desperate to save his crumbling image." Brandon organized a family unity dinner for that evening. He invited Madison's parents, 2 retired teachers who thought the sun rose and set on their son-in-law, to act as buffers. It was a pathetic attempt to guilt me into silence. Before the dinner, I asked Madison to meet me at a coffee shop on the edge of town. She arrived wearing dark sunglasses and a trench coat, looking like a celebrity trying to avoid the paparazzi, though the only people watching were the barista and me. I slid a manila envelope across the table. "What is this?" Madison asked, her voice brittle. "It is a copy of the freeze order," I said. "You have not checked your accounts yet, have you? The house, the joint savings, even your Madison Hart Lifestyle business account. They are all locked by the bank as of this morning. Proceeds of crime." Madison went pale. She pulled the papers out, her manicured hands shaking. For years, she had looked down on me as a financial failure. Now, she was staring at the reality that every latte, every handbag, and every yoga retreat she had posted about online had been paid for by skimming the pensions of people like her own parents. I did not know," Madison stammered, tears welling up. He told me. He said it was all bonuses. I am not dragging you down. Madison, I said, my voice firm, but not unkind. I am just stopping the charade. I am no longer shielding my son. If you want to protect your children, you need to stop putting lipstick on a monster. The money is gone. Do not let your integrity go with it. That night, the dining room on Maple Drive was a theater of the absurd. Brandon had ordered expensive catering, but plated it as if it were a home-cooked meal. He poured wine for Madison's parents, laughing too loudly at their mundane stories about gardening. He pulled out my chair for me, placing a napkin on my lap with trembling hands. "Mum, try the roast," Brandon said, smiling so hard his face looked like a mask. "It is your favorite. You know, having everyone here, it reminds me of what matters. Family. We stick together, right through thick and thin." I ate in silence. The food tasted like ash. When the plates were cleared, Brandon made his move. He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Mum," he started, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "About tomorrow. The lawyer says if you testify, the press will have a field day. They will say you are vindictive. They will say, a mother eating her own young. Think about Emily and Josh. If I go away, they are practically orphans. Do you want them to be the kids whose grandmother sent their dad to prison?" Madison looked down at her lap. Her parents looked at me with confusion and judgment, unaware of the truth. I placed my fork down gently. I looked at my son, really looked at him. I saw the fear. Yes. But I also saw the calculation. He was not sorry for what he had done. He was sorry he had been caught. "Brandon," I said softly, "when you sat in those living rooms and convinced 80-year-old widows to sign over their life savings, did you think about their grandchildren? Did you think about their families?" The table went deadly silent. "That is different." Brandon snapped, his mask slipping. "That was business. This is family." I stood up. I smoothed the front of my old navy dress. "Tomorrow, in court, you will know everything." I announced to the room, "You will know exactly who owns what, and who owes what. Enjoy this evening. Brandon. This is the last meal we will ever eat in this house as a family." Brandon slammed his fist onto the table, the silverware jumping with a violent clatter. "You are ruining everything," he screamed, his face turning purple. "You are a bitter old witch." Madison jumped up, grabbing the arms of the two terrified children who had been watching from the hallway. Upstairs. Now she yelled, her voice breaking. I turned my back on my screaming son and walked out into the cool Colorado night. I did not look back. The severance was complete. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver was a cavern of polished wood and cold judgment. The gallery was packed to capacity, a sea of grey heads and walker frames. These were the people my son had called low-hanging fruit. Interspersed among them were the hungry eyes of the press, pens poised to capture the fall of a local golden boy. Brandon walked in, flanked by his defense team. He wore his best charcoal suit, but it hung loosely on his frame. His eyes were dark hollows, rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the last week realizing the world was not built to serve him. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at me. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with eyes like flint, laid out the charges. She spoke of wire fraud, securities fraud, and elder abuse. She detailed how money from new investors flowed directly into Brandon's personal accounts to pay for the Aspen trips and the Tesla. She spoke of $3 million stolen from teachers, mechanics, and nurses. Then, they called Lionel Brooks. Lionel took the stand, adjusting his glasses. He walked the court through the complex architecture of Marigold Ember Trust Works. He explained the shell companies, the blind trusts, and the acquisition of the commercial building where Brandon's firm operated. He explained the ownership of the house on Maple Drive. "Mr. Brooks," the prosecutor asked, "who is the ultimate controlling party of Marigold Ember Trust Works and all its subsidiary assets?" Lionel looked directly at Brandon. "The sole managing member and trust protector is Mrs. Eleanor Hart," Lionel said clearly. The room erupted in a collective gasp. It was a physical wave of sound. Brandon spun around in his chair, his neck snapping back so fast I thought it might break. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. "Mom," Brandon whispered, the word carrying across the silent space between us. You own the building." I was called next. I walked to the witness stand, my steps echoing on the parquet floor. I swore to tell the truth. I sat down and looked at my son. "Mrs. Hart," the prosecutor began, "why did you keep your ownership of these assets a secret from your son?" "I wanted to see who he would become if he thought no one was watching," I answered, my voice steady. "I provided him with a rent-controlled building and a safety net. I treated it as a moral laboratory. I wanted to see if he would build something of value, or if he would just take." Brandon's lawyer, a man with expensive hair and a cheap soul, tried to attack me on cross-examination. "So, you admit you manipulated him?" the lawyer accused, leaning against the railing. "You created a false reality. You trapped him in a cage of your own making." "I did not trap him," I replied. "I did not force him to lie to pensioners. I did not force him to fake yield reports. I simply did not stop him from showing us who he really was." The prosecutor then played the recording from the night Brandon came to my room. The audio was crisp. The courtroom listened in horrified silence as Brandon's voice filled the air, admitting to the fees, the hidden structures, and asking his mother to commit perjury to save his reputation. It is just a little creative accounting. Mom," Brandon's recorded voice stammered, breathless and panicked. "If you sign it, I can fix this." In the courtroom, the real Brandon put his head on the table and covered his ears. Then came the final blow. I looked at the judge, then at my son. "There is one last thing," I said into the microphone. "Before this investigation began, I executed my power as trust protector. The Hart Family Trust has been restructured. The beneficiary rights for the house, the commercial properties, and the investment portfolio have been irrevocably transferred to my grandchildren, Emily and Josh, under the guardianship of a blind non-profit organization." Brandon looked up, his eyes wide with the realization of total financial death. "He gets nothing?" the defense lawyer asked, stunned. "He gets exactly what he earned," I said. I leaned forward, speaking directly to the man who had tried to evict me from my own life. "My son threatened to cut me off unless I paid him," I said, my voice ringing with the finality of a gavel. "But the truth is, I just cut him off from the money of the elderly people he was eating alive." The recess was short, but the silence in the plea negotiation room stretched into what felt like a lifetime. The room was a windowless box with beige walls and a heavy oak table. Brandon sat opposite me, flanked by his lawyer and Lionel. My son's face was the color of old ash, and his hands were clenched so tight on the table that his knuckles had turned a bruised purple. The prosecutor did not waste time. She tossed a thin file onto the table. "Here is the offer, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice devoid of sympathy. "You plead guilty to all 12 counts. You agree to full asset forfeiture. You accept a sentence of 5 to 7 years in a federal facility, followed by lifetime financial monitoring. In exchange, we do not pursue the additional charges of wire fraud against your wife." Brandon made a sound like a wounded animal. He looked at his lawyer, desperate for a magic trick. But the lawyer just shook his head. "If we go to trial, Brandon," the lawyer whispered, "they will give you 20 years. Minimum." I did not speak. I simply slid a second document across the table. It was not a legal filing from the court. It was a binding resolution from Marigold Ember Trustworks. Brandon looked down at it, his eyes red and watery. "What? What is this?" Brandon asked, his voice trembling. "It is a restitution agreement," I said calmly. "The trust will liquidate the commercial building and 80% of the investment portfolio. The proceeds will establish a victim compensation fund. Every person you stole from will get their principal back. But there is a condition. The fund only activates if you sign that plea deal right now and admit to everything." Brandon stared at the paper. He realized the trap I had set. I was using the very fortune he had coveted to fix the mess he had made, leaving him with nothing but his name and a prison number. He looked up at me, a flash of his old hatred breaking through the fear. You set me up," Brandon hissed, tears spilling over. "If you had just told me, if I had known you had money, I would never have done this. You let me walk into this trap, you are the villain here. If you were a decent man, Brandon." I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to draw blood. "The size of my bank account would not have changed your character. You did not steal because you were poor. You stole because you thought you were entitled to everything without earning anything." The room went quiet. Brandon looked at the pen in front of him. He looked at the prosecutor, who was checking her watch. He looked at Lionel, who offered him no pity. Finally, he picked up the pen. His hand shook so violently that the tip of the pen tapped a rhythmic beat against the paper. He signed his name. The signature was a jagged scrawl, barely legible. It was the signature of a man who finally understood he owned absolutely nothing. The sentencing hearing 2 days later was a formality, but the judge had a sense of poetic justice. He peered over his spectacles at Brandon. "Mr. Hart, in addition to your custodial sentence of 6 years," the judge announced, "part of your supervised release will include mandatory community service. You will spend 500 hours assisting in financial literacy programs for low-income seniors. You will spend your days explaining to others how to protect themselves from men like you." The gavel came down. The sound was final. Reporters swarmed me on the courthouse steps as the marshals led Brandon away in cuffs. The wind in Denver was fierce that afternoon, whipping my hair across my face. A young woman with a microphone thrust it toward me. "Mrs. Hart. Do you have any regrets?" she shouted over the wind. "Some people are saying you pushed your own son into prison. Do you feel guilty?" I stopped and looked directly into the camera lens. "I did not push him," I said. "I just stopped catching him." Sometimes, the most cruel thing you can do to a person is let the truth do the rest of the work. I walked away from the microphones, towards the empty parking lot. I stood by my old sedan, the same car Brandon had mocked a week ago. I looked back at the concrete fortress where my son would spend the next few years. I looked at my own wrinkled hands. They were empty, but they were free. No one threatens to cut me off from my own life anymore. I whispered to the wind. I got into the car and turned the key. The engine started with a reliable hum. I drove away, leaving the wreckage of my son's ego in the rearview mirror, finally debt-free in every way that mattered. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you folks are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story reach more people.